When I was 10, my family moved to a new town and a new house, and I was starting 5th grade at a completely unfamiliar school. Being the new kid was tough. Everyone already had their friends, and I felt awkward at lunch and on the playground. But soon enough, I began to meet a few kids in the neighborhood. One of them was Rory, who went to a private school. We met while riding our bikes, and he asked if I had just moved into the house on the corner. We hit it off, and for a little while I thought maybe I was finally making friends. A few days later, I met Eli. One afternoon, he rang our doorbell. My parents answered and introduced me to him. Eli said he lived down the block and asked if I liked video games. Of course I did. He invited me over to his place to play Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas, a game I'd always wanted to try. Excitedly, I agreed, and we walked together to his house. From the outside, Eli's house was nothing like the neat, well-kept homes in our neighborhood. It was at the very end of the block and looked run down, with overgrown patches of dirt in the yard and a cracked walkway leading to the door. Inside, the house was even more disorganized. Boxes, old furniture, and clutter seemed to be everywhere. Eli led me down to the basement, which smelled damp and musty, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Despite the mess, we found an old leather couch in front of a dusty TV and settled in. He booted up his old GameCube and PS2, and we spent a couple of fun hours playing the game. For that brief time, I even began to think that Eli might become a true friend. But things soon took a strange turn. As the evening ended, I started to feel the need to go home. I told Eli I was leaving, but he followed me halfway down the block, looking visibly disappointed and insistent on walking with me. I politely said, "See you later," but deep down I already sensed something was off about him. The next day, Eli showed up again, ringing our doorbell and asking for me. I'd already told my mom to let him know that I wouldn't be home if he came by, so she did. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. Late that September night, I woke up suddenly to a cool breeze and discovered that my window, which I always kept closed, was wide open. My heart raced as I wondered who or what could have left it that way. Then, I felt a sudden poke on my foot. I bolted upright in bed and screamed. There, at the foot of my bed, stood Eli. In a quiet, almost soothing voice, he said, "It's just me." Before I could even ask why he was in my room, he began explaining that his parents were fighting and he needed a place to sleep. I couldn't believe my ears. Eli had climbed through my window. Shock and fear gripped me as I told him to leave immediately. Despite his pleading for me to let him stay, I refused. I watched in disbelief as he turned and climbed back out, disappearing into the night. I quickly closed and locked my window, then rushed to wake my parents. The next day, my parents went over to talk with Eli's family, but the conversation didn't go well at all. Eli's mother was erratic. She screamed and laughed at my parents, refusing to take any responsibility for her son's actions. My parents hesitated to involve the police since Eli was just a kid, but the situation left me deeply unsettled. In the days that followed, I began waking up to the sound of persistent knocking at my window. Even though I kept my blinds tightly closed, I could tell it was Eli. The knocks continued for what felt like an eternity, and I even heard him trying to open the window. Each time, my heart pounded harder with fear. A few days later, while riding my bike with Rory and another friend, Connor, we passed by Eli's house. I noticed him running to the window and watching us pass by. I later told my friends about the strange sight, and one of them remarked that Eli looked like the type of person who would live in a creepy, neglected house. Then one night, everything came to a head. I was jolted awake by a loud crash. Rushing to my window, I saw that it had been shattered. I screamed as I watched Eli climb through the broken glass, slipping past the closed blinds. Panicked, I ran straight to my parents' room and woke them up. By the time my dad rushed outside to chase him, Eli had already disappeared. My dad chased him all the way back to his house, pounding on the door until, somehow, he convinced Eli's parents to cover the cost of the broken window rather than involving the police. They paid up, and after that, I never saw or heard from Eli again. I did catch fleeting glimpses of him a couple of times as we drove past his old house over the next few years. Eventually, his family moved away, leaving me with a lingering sense of unease. Even now, I can't help but wonder what kind of person Eli might have grown up to be. Was he just a troubled kid seeking attention? Or was there something far more dangerous behind his unsettling behavior? The memories still send shivers down my spine, and I shudder at the thought of what might have been if things had escalated further. Story number 2. It was a night I'll never forget. I was only 8 years old, living with my parents, Linda and David, and my older brother Max, who was at least 10 years my senior. I was sound asleep when an unexpected commotion downstairs pulled me from my dreams. At first I thought it might be my parents, but the hurried, anxious voices told me something was wrong. I cracked open my door and listened closely. I could hear Linda and David speaking in hushed, tense tones about something I couldn't quite understand. Still half asleep, I crept toward the stairway and called out, "Mom, Dad." Almost immediately, Linda's familiar voice answered from below, "Go back to bed," as if everything were normal. Although confused, I obeyed and returned to my room. Just as I began to drift off again, I heard the front door slam shut with a force that sent a chill through me. In the dead silence that followed, I assumed my parents had left, though I had no idea why. Soon enough, a series of soft footsteps, the quiet clatter of drawers opening and closing, and even what sounded like the refrigerator door creaking open, reached my ears. I convinced myself that maybe Max, coming home late as he often did, was rummaging around in the kitchen. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. They grew steadily louder until they reached the top of my hallway. My heart pounded as my bedroom door slowly creaked open. In the dim light, all I could see was a dark, formless shape, a vague outline that resembled a human head. In a trembling voice, I called out every name I knew. "Max! Mom! Dad!" But there was no answer. The door simply closed quietly, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and mounting fear. Assuming it might be David coming to check on me, I tried to shake off my unease, but later my curiosity got the better of me. I ventured quietly downstairs, leaving all the lights off to keep the darkness as my shield. As I approached the kitchen, I froze. Standing in the middle of the room was a tall, shadowy figure. With a hesitant "Dad?" escaping my lips, I was met not with a reassuring reply, but with a deep, unfamiliar voice that said, "Go back upstairs." In that moment, terror overtook me. I bolted back to my room, threw the door shut, and hid under the covers, my mind reeling with questions. The unsettling night didn't end there. Soon I heard the front door open again, and the familiar sounds of Linda and David rushing back into the house. They found me wide awake on the stairs, their faces etched with shock. When I finally asked what had happened, they explained that Max had been in a car accident. I later learned that he had been driving when he wasn't supposed to, and that our parents had received a frantic call from the hospital. In their haste to leave and check on him, they had forgotten one crucial detail. They hadn't locked the door. It wasn't until much later that I realized the gravity of that night. When I asked David if he'd ever come into my room, he admitted he had, and that our unlocked door meant I was never as safe as I'd thought. Linda was beside herself, scolding David for the oversight. My mention of the mysterious figure at my door and in the kitchen had sent him into a panic. He grabbed his gun and combed through the house while Linda called the police. I even remember a police officer gently questioning me, trying to piece together the night's events. My parents later told me they felt utterly foolish, having to explain to the authorities that they'd left me alone in a house that wasn't secure. No valuable items were stolen that night, but the terror of knowing a complete stranger had been inside our home has haunted me ever since. Even at the tender age of 8, that night served as a stark reminder of how quickly safety can vanish, leaving you to face the unknown in the darkness. Story number 3. It was around 2013 when our family moved into a new home, a modest house with a cozy fireplace and a promise of simpler living. all while keeping us close to school. My younger brother, Caleb, was especially excited about the change. He adored all things superhero, and his prized possession was a Batman car toy that lit up and made cool sounds whenever a button was pressed. One sunny afternoon, after playing outside, Caleb burst into the living room holding something unusual. It was an old, worn-out school photo tag, smudged and faded to the point where you couldn't even tell what year it was taken. With an odd certainty in his eyes, he said, "This is Rocco. He's my friend." I stared at him, puzzled. Caleb wasn't one to make friends easily, so I assumed he might have befriended someone in the neighborhood. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a quirky keepsake from our new surroundings. That night, around 3 a.m., when the rest of the house was deep in sleep, I was startled awake by soft voices coming from Caleb's room. Annoyed at being disturbed, I crept into his room to tell him it was late and he should go back to sleep. But what I saw made my skin crawl. Caleb was sitting upright in bed, talking as if he were conversing with someone unseen. His tone was calm, almost as if he were having a perfectly ordinary chat. I urged him to settle down and then left, still feeling unsettled. In the days that followed, Mom mentioned that Caleb had been acting even more strangely, waking at odd hours to speak quietly to someone. I tried to brush it off as typical kid behavior. However, one night, I was lying in my room. My bed was right by the door, so I could easily see into the hallway, when I was startled by the familiar whirring sound of his Batman car toy. I went over to his room to scold him, but found him fast asleep, with the toy still buzzing on the floor. I turned it off, trying to convince myself that it was just a mechanical glitch. But then, almost every night, one of us, Mom, Dad, or my sister, would hear the toy making its mysterious noise, and we'd all end up in Caleb's room to turn it off. I couldn't help but bring up the fact that Caleb kept talking about his friend, Rocco. One evening, Dad insisted that the toy must be motion activated, even though the packaging made no mention of any such feature. My sister and I grew increasingly uneasy, so we eventually started sleeping in the same room to feel safer. Then, one fateful night, while my sister and I were trying to calm our racing hearts by chatting quietly, we heard that dreaded sound again. We both looked toward our open door and then into Caleb's room, which was right across from us. To our horror, we saw the Batman car toy rolling slowly by itself, as if guided by an invisible hand. We screamed and bolted to wake our parents. When they rushed in, they were furious with Caleb, accusing him of playing a cruel joke on us while we were all terrified. His response, however, sent shivers down our spines. It wasn't me. Rocco wanted to play tonight. In a desperate attempt to restore a sense of normalcy, our parents threw the toy into the trash and removed its batteries. For a while, my sister and I felt relieved, but the very next day, Caleb somehow had the toy back. When our parents accused him of retrieving it from the trash, he simply replied, "Rocco got it for me." Finally, the toy was dismantled and discarded for good, leaving Caleb visibly upset, though our parents soon replaced it with a new Batman figurine. Just when we thought the strange occurrences had ended and Rocco was gone for good, one evening Mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Out of nowhere, we heard a loud crash. Rushing in, we discovered the George Foreman grill had been hurled halfway across the kitchen. Mom swore it hadn't been near the counter's edge, and Dad was left with no explanation for the bizarre event. We eventually moved out about a year later, but I still can't shake the feeling that Caleb's mysterious friend, Rocco, was never just an imaginary companion. Even now, I wonder if there was something truly otherworldly behind those inexplicable moments in our once peaceful home. Thanks for listening. Good night, and have a restful sleep.